Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. Picture this. It's 1775, and you're standing on the edge of what people called civilization. Behind you, there are towns, farms, roads that actually lead somewhere. But in front of you, nothing but endless wilderness stretching beyond the horizon like an ocean of trees and mountains that nobody has ever mapped. Most people would take one look at that vast unknown and turn right back around, but not Daniel Boone. This guy looked at that wilderness and saw something completely different. He saw the world's greatest playground. Before we continue this journey, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extraordinary for you. Now, when we think about entertainment today, we've got Netflix, video games, social media, all this stuff designed to keep us busy every second of the day. But imagine for a moment what entertainment looked like when your nearest neighbor might be 300 miles away, and your idea of technology was a flintlock rifle and a steel knife. What do you do for fun when there's literally nothing around you but forest, mountains, and wild animals that would love to make you their next meal? Here's what's absolutely fascinating about this story, I know, Kay. These men didn't just survive in the wilderness. They thrived. They took the most challenging, dangerous, lonely existence you could imagine and turned it into the greatest adventure story ever told. And it all started with guys like Daniel Boone, who looked at a grizzly bear not as a threat, but as the star of tonight's entertainment. Boone was carving paths through Kentucky's dark forests, while the Revolutionary War was still being fought. Think about that for a second. While people back east were worried about British taxes and political representation, Boone was out there turning survival into sport. He'd spend months alone in the woods, and when he finally made it back to civilization, he didn't come back with complaints about how hard it was. He came back with stories. Incredible, unbelievable stories that made people's jaws drop. And here's the crazy part. He wasn't exaggerating. Well, maybe a little, but that was part of the entertainment. Boone figured out something that would become the foundation of American frontier culture. The line between survival and entertainment was a lot thinner than anyone realized. By 1820, when America had bought the Louisiana Territory and suddenly had more land than anyone knew what to do with, a whole new breed of men started pushing even deeper into the unknown. These weren't your typical farmers or merchants looking for a place to settle down. These were adventurers, and they had names that sounded like they came straight out of a legend: Jedediah Smith, Bill Williams, Hugh Glass, Jim Bridger. Now, you might be wondering what drove these guys to leave everything behind and head into territories where no white man had ever walked. Was it money? Fame? Some kind of death wish? Well, here's what I find absolutely remarkable about these mountain men. They went out there because they discovered that the wilderness wasn't just a place to survive. It was a place to live more fully than anyone had ever lived before. Think about Jedediah Smith for a moment. This guy didn't just trap beaver. He explored more of the American West than any single person in history. He walked from the Great Salt Lake to California, became the first white man to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, and mapped routes that would later become major highways. But here's what makes his story so incredible. He did it all while treating every single day like it was the adventure of a lifetime. Smith would wake up in the morning not one mose, knowing if he'd encounter a grizzly bear, discover a new river, meet a Native American tribe, or find himself in the middle of a blizzard that could last for weeks. And instead of being terrified by that uncertainty, he was energized by it. Every day was a new chapter in the greatest story ever told, and he was both the author and the main character. Bill Williams took this philosophy even further. This guy was so comfortable in the wilderness that other mountain men thought he was half crazy. He'd disappear for months at a time, living completely alone in the most remote corners of the Rockies. When he finally showed up at trading posts, he'd have stories that seemed impossible. He claimed he could talk to animals, predict the weather weeks in advance, and find his way through mountain ranges in complete darkness. Now, was Bill Williams actually able to communicate with wildlife? Probably not in the way he claimed. But here's what's fascinating. He had developed such an intimate the understanding of the natural world that it might as well have been magic. He could read animal behavior, weather patterns, and seasonal changes with an accuracy that amazed everyone who knew him. And he turned this knowledge into entertainment, spinning tales around campfires that left grown men sitting in stunned silence. But the real genius of these early mountain men was how they transformed the most basic elements of survival into sources of entertainment. Take winter, for example. For most people, winter in the mountains meant months of misery, cold, isolation, and the constant threat of starvation. But mountain men like Hugh Glass turned winter into their most creative season. Glass would spend weeks preparing for winter not just by gathering food and firewood, but by collecting materials for entertainment. He'd carve game pieces from elk bone, practice new card tricks, and mentally rehearse stories he'd been developing all year. When the snows came, and he was trapped in his day cabin for months, he wasn't just surviving, he was perfecting his craft. And what was his craft? The art of turning life into legend. You see, these men figured out something profound about human nature. We don't just need food, water, and shelter to survive. We need meaning. We need stories. We need to feel like our lives matter, like we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And in the wilderness, surrounded by beauty and danger on a scale that most people could never imagine, they found that meaning in the most unexpected places. A simple bear encounter became a test of courage that would be retold for generations. A difficult river crossing became an epic adventure worthy of Homer. A successful hunt became a celebration that could last for days. They took the raw materials of survival and transformed them into entertainment that was more thrilling than anything civilization could offer. Here's what really gets me about this story. These guys were creating the blueprint for what would become distinctly American entertainment. They were developing the tall tale, the heroic adventure story, the celebration of individual courage against impossible odds. They were inventing the Western before there were any Western movies to watch, but they weren't doing it for audiences back east. They were doing it for each other, and ultimately, they were doing it for themselves. Because when you're completely alone in the wilderness for months at a time, you better have some pretty good entertainment or you're going to lose your mind. The psychological challenges of wilderness living were just as dangerous as the physical ones. Isolation could drive men insane. The constant stress of survival could break even the strongest spirits. But these mountain men discovered that entertainment wasn't just a luxury. It was a survival tool as important as their rifles or their knives. Around those lonely campfires, with nothing but flickering flames holding back the darkness, they discovered that stories could keep them sane, competition could keep them sharp, laughter could keep them human. And all of this became the foundation for a culture of entertainment that was unlike anything the world had ever seen. By the time we get to the 1820s, word was starting to spread back east about these incredible characters living in the mountains. Newspapers would occasionally print their stories, usually with disclaimers about how hard they were to believe, but people were fascinated. Here were men who had figured out how to live completely free, answering to nobody, creating their own rules and their own entertainment in a world where anything was possible. And this fascination would soon lead to something amazing, because these isolated mountain men were about to discover that they weren't as alone as they thought. There were hundreds of others just like them scattered across the Rockies, all developing their own forms of wilderness, entertainment. And when they finally came together, well, that's where our story really begins to get interesting. Because what happened when 800 of these larger-than-life characters converged in one place was something that had never been seen before in American history. It was part county fair, part military campaign, part religious revival, and part three-ring circus. It was called the Rendezvous, and it would become the greatest show in the American West. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we can understand how these mountain men created the most spectacular entertainment gatherings in frontier history, we need to understand what drew them to the wilderness in the first place. We need to understand how they survived, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally in a world that could be beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. These weren't just tough guys looking for a fight. These were artists, philosophers, storytellers, and dreamers who found in the wilderness a canvas big enough for their imaginations. They were creating a new way of being human, one that balanced the ancient need for community with the equally ancient need for individual freedom. And they were proving something that would become central to the American character, that entertainment doesn't come from having more stuff or more options. It comes from having more life, more adventure, more stories worth telling. It comes from pushing boundaries, taking risks, and discovering what you're really capable of when everything safe and familiar is stripped away. Tomorrow, we're going to witness what happened when all of these individual wilderness entertainers came together for the first time. We're going to see how the Rendezvous transformed Mountain Man entertainment from private survival strategy into public spectacle. And you're going to meet some characters whose adventures were so incredible, so over the top, that they sound like fiction, except they really happened. Until then, think about this. What would you do for entertainment if you had nothing but your own creativity and the natural world around you? What stories would you tell? What games would you invent? What adventures would you seek out? Because that's exactly what these mountain men figured out, and it changed American culture forever. Welcome back. I hope you've been thinking about what we discovered yesterday, how these incredible mountain men turned survival into the ultimate form of entertainment. Today, we're about to witness something that will absolutely blow your mind. We're going to the first great rendezvous gathering of 1825, where 800 of these wilderness entertainers came together to create the most spectacular show the American frontier had ever seen. Picture this scene with me for a moment. You're standing in the Green River Valley in what's now Wyoming. It's July, the height of summer, and the mountain meadows are exploding with wildflowers. The air is crisp and clean, with snow-capped peaks surrounding you on all sides. And then, from every direction, they start arriving. First, you see the dust clouds on the horizon. Then you hear the sounds, horses whinnying, men shouting, the crack of whips, and something else. Laughter. Lots and lots of laughter. Because what's approaching isn't an army or a migration. It's the greatest gathering of entertainers, storytellers, competitors, and adventurers that North America has ever seen. 800 mountain men converged on this valley from across the entire Rocky Mountain region. Think about that number for a second. 800 men who had been living in complete isolation for months, some for an entire year, all coming together at once. These weren't just any men. These were the toughest, most independent, most entertaining characters on the continent, and they had been saving up stories, jokes, competitions, and challenges for this exact moment. But here's what makes this gathering absolutely incredible. It wasn't just mountain men who showed up. Native American tribes came too, bringing their own traditions of entertainment and competition. Crow warriors arrived with their fastest horses and their most skilled riders. Shoshone hunters brought their sacred games and their own legendary storytellers. Ute traders came with gambling games that tested perception and luck in ways that amazed even the mountain men. Now, I need you to understand something about the scale of what was happening here. This wasn't just a trading post or a business meeting. The American Fur Company had essentially created the world's first pop-up entertainment festival in the middle of the wilderness. They brought wagons loaded with everything these men had been craving during their months of isolation. coffee, sugar, whiskey, tobacco, and playing cards that could survive mountain weather. But the company executives were smart. They knew that men who has been alone in the wilderness for months wouldn't just want to buy supplies and head back out. They would want to celebrate, compete, and reconnect with human civilization. So they orchestrated these gatherings like master showmen, knowing that mountain men would spend every single cent they had earned during a year of trapping for just a few weeks of carefully orchestrated fun and chaos. And what chaos it was! Jim Bridger became the undisputed king of storytelling at these gatherings. This guy had perfected the art of the tall tale to a degree that left grown men sitting around campfires with their mouths hanging open. His most famous story was about a petrified forest where everything had turned to stone, the trees, the grass, even the birds that were still singing petrified songs. Now, here's what's brilliant about Bridger's storytelling technique. He would start with something that was actually true. There really was a petrified forest in what's now Yellowstone National Park. But then he would layer on increasingly impossible details with such conviction and such perfect timing that his audience would be completely swept up in the story. By the time he got to the part about petrified birds singing petrified songs, everyone was so invested in the tale that they almost wanted to believe it was true. But Bridger wasn't just entertaining his audience, he was teaching them something profound about the nature of storytelling itself. He was showing them that the line between truth and fiction wasn't as important as the line between boring and fascinating. And in the wilderness, where life was already stranger than most people could imagine, fascination was the currency that mattered most. Meanwhile, Joe Meek was establishing himself as the ultimate competitor. This guy would challenge anyone to anything. Shooting contests, wrestling matches, drinking competitions, horse races, you name it. And he didn't just want to win. He wanted to win so spectacularly that his victories would become stories in themselves. Meek's shooting demonstrations were legendary. He could split a bullet on the edge of an axe blade, putting half the bullet on each side of the target. He could shoot playing cards edgewise at 50 paces. He could hit a silver dollar thrown into the air with a pistol while riding a galloping horse. But here's what made Meek truly remarkable. He understood that his skill was meaningless without showmanship. Before every shooting demonstration, Meek would work the crowd like a carnival barker. He'd tell jokes, place bets, challenge hecklers, and build suspense until the entire gathering was focused on his performance. And then, when he made his impossible shot, the explosion of cheers and applause wasn't just about his marksmanship. It was about the complete entertainment experience he had created. The gambling at these rendezvous gatherings was on a scale that's hard to imagine. Men would bet their entire year's earnings on a single card game. But this wasn't desperate gambling. This was entertainment gambling, where the thrill of the risk was often more valuable than the money involved. The most popular game was called Old Sledge, which was basically an early version of poker, played with a deck of cards that had been specially treated to survive wilderness conditions. These cards were made from thick paper, coated with a kind of wax that made them waterproof, and marked with symbols that were easy to read by firelight. But the mountain men didn't just play the game, they turned it into theatre. They developed elaborate rules for bluffing, ritual phrases for raising bets, and a whole culture around reading your opponent's tells. A single hand of Old Sledge could take an hour to play, with each decision becoming a dramatic moment that held the entire table in suspense. And here's where the Native American influence became really important. Tribal representatives introduced the mountain men to games that were completely unlike anything they had ever seen. The Crow had a game called Hand Game that was part gambling, part magic show, part psychological warfare. In Hand Game, players would hide small objects in their hands while singing traditional songs and making elaborate gestures designed to confuse their opponents. The goal was to guess which hand held the object, but the real entertainment came from the incredible showmanship that surrounded each round. Players would tell stories, act out characters, and create such elaborate distractions that sometimes the audience forgot there was even a game being played. The Mountain Men were absolutely fascinated by these tribal games because they required skills that went far beyond luck or physical ability. They required the ability to read human nature, to control your own emotions, and to create convincing performances under pressure. In other words, they required exactly the same skills that mountain men used to survive in wilderness. But the most spectacular entertainment at these rendezvous gatherings was the horse racing. And I'm not talking about simple races around a track. These were elaborate competitions that could last for days and cover distances of 50 miles or more. Native American tribes brought their finest horses and their most skilled riders. These weren't just fast horses. They were animals that had been bred and trained for generations specifically for racing. And the riders weren't just skilled, they were artists who could make a horse do things that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Mountain men would bet everything they owned on these races. Not just money, but their rifles, their traps, their horses, even their winter supplies. And the races themselves became epic journeys that tested not just speed, but endurance, navigation skills, and the ability to handle unexpected challenges. I want you to imagine watching one of these races. The course might start in the green, river valley, head up into the mountains, cross several rivers, navigate through forest trails that were barely wide enough for a horse, and then finish back at the rendezvous camp. Riders had to be part athlete, part navigator, part veterinarian, and part entertainer, because crowds would gather at various points along the course to cheer and place additional bets. And here's what's absolutely remarkable about these competitions. They weren't just entertainment, they were also practical training for the kind of riding skills that could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. A mountain man who could win a rendezvous horse race was a mountain man who could outrun hostile war parties, chase down wounded game, or cross dangerous terrain in emergency situations. The storytelling contests were just as competitive as the physical competitions. Every night, different campfires would host storytelling sessions that lasted until dawn, and these weren't casual conversations, ATS. They were performances where reputation and respect were on the line. The rules were simple but challenging. Every story had to be something that the teller claimed had actually happened to him personally. It could be embellished, dramatized, and improved for entertainment value, but it had to start with a grain of real experience. And the audience was sophisticated. These were men who had lived incredible adventures themselves, so they could tell the difference between a story that was based on real wilderness experience and one that was pure fiction. The storytelling contests created a kind of oral library of mountain man adventures. Stories about encounters with grizzly bears, narrow escapes from hostile tribes, impossible shots that saved lives, and acts of endurance that pushed human limits. But more than that, they created a shared culture where individual experiences became collective entertainment. Think about what was happening here from a psychological perspective. These men spent most of their time in complete isolation, dealing with challenges that no one else could understand. But at the rendezvous, they found audiences who not only understood their experiences but could appreciate them as entertainment. It was validation, therapy, and performance art all rolled into one. The practical jokes at these gatherings were elaborate productions that could take months to plan and execute. The most famous involved Hugh Glass, who was already legendary for surviving a grizzly bear attack and crawling 200 miles to safety. Glass convinced a group of newcomers that wolverines could be domesticated and trained as hunting companions. He spent weeks before the rendezvous setting up this joke. He captured a young wolverine, built a special cage, and developed an elaborate story about how he had trained this animal to track wounded game and retrieve small objects. When the newcomers arrived, Glass demonstrated his trained wolverines' abilities using tricks that were actually based on the animal's natural behaviors. The joke reached its climax when Glass offered to sell his trained Wolverine to the highest bidder. The newcomers got into a bidding war that drove the price up to several $100s, a fortune in Mountain Man terms. And then, just as the winning bidder was about to take possession of his new hunting companion, Glass released the Wolverine, which immediately ran off into the forest, leaving everyone laughing except the poor guy who had just spent his life savings on thin air. But here's what made this joke brilliant. It wasn't just about fooling people. It was about teaching them something important about the wilderness. Glass was showing these newcomers that the line between possible and impossible was very different in the mountains than it was in civilization. He was preparing them for a world where they would encounter things that seemed unbelievable but were actually true. As these, the rendezvous gatherings continued year after year, they developed their own traditions and rituals that became as important as any religious ceremony. There were formal opening ceremonies where veteran mountain men would welcome newcomers and share the unofficial rules of rendezvous behavior. There were closing ceremonies where men would make plans for the coming year and exchange information about territory conditions. And through it all, the entertainment never stopped. From dawn until well past midnight, there was always something happening. Competitions, stories, jokes, games, demonstrations, and performances that kept hundreds of men engaged and entertained for weeks at a time. Tomorrow, we're going to see what happened when these entertainment traditions reached their absolute peak in the 1830s. We're going to meet the undisputed champions of Mountain Man entertainment and witness competitions that were so spectacular they became legends that lasted for generations. But for now, I want you to think about this incredible gathering we've just witnessed. 800 men who had chosen to live completely outside of civilization, coming together to create their own form of civilization based entirely on entertainment, competition, and storytelling. They proved that human beings don't need cities, theaters, or formal institutions to create profound and meaningful entertainment experiences. They just need imagination, courage, and the willingness to turn every aspect of life into an opportunity for wonder and celebration. Welcome back to our journey through the incredible world of Mountain Man entertainment. Yesterday, we witnessed the explosive beginning of the rendezvous gatherings. Today, we're entering the Golden Age, 1830s, when mountain men ruled an empire of entertainment that stretched from the Continental Divide to the Pacific Ocean. Get ready to meet the undisputed legends who turned wilderness survival into high art. The 1830s were when everything came together perfectly for these mountain men. The beaver trade was booming, new territories were opening up every year, and a whole generation of entertainers had perfected their skills to an almost supernatural degree. These weren't just tough guys surviving in the wilderness anymore. They were artists, performers, and master craftsmen of adventure. At the center of it all was Kit Carson, who had become something like the Shakespeare of the wilderness. Now, you might know Carson's name from history books as a famous scout and guide, but what made him legendary among mountain men was his ability to weave stories so elaborate and so perfectly timed that they required 3 entire nights to complete. Picture this scene. It's a winter evening at a remote trading post. Snow is falling outside, the wind is howling through the mountain passes, and inside, around a crackling fire, 30 or 40 mountain men are gathered in complete silence. And there's Kit Carson, standing in the firelight, acting out every character in an adventure story that involves him tracking a wounded grizzly bear through a blizzard, getting lost in a maze of canyons, encountering a band of hostile warriors, and finally escaping by riding his horse off a cliff into a raging river. But here's what made Carson truly brilliant as a storyteller. He understood that the best entertainment comes from the details. He wouldn't just say, "I shot the bear." He would describe the color of the bear's eyes, the sound its claws made on the rocks, the way his horse trembled beneath him, the exact angle of the wind, and the split-second timing required to make the shot that saved his life. Carson's three-night stories became legendary throughout the mountains. Men would travel hundreds of miles just to hear one of his complete performances, and each telling was slightly different, because Carson was constantly improving his craft, adding new details, refining his timing, and responding to his audience's reactions. Meanwhile, Tom Fitzpatrick was developing what might have been the most sophisticated form of wilderness entertainment ever created: psychological poker. Fitzpatrick didn't just play cards. He studied human nature with the intensity of a scientist and the creativity of an artist. Fitzpatrick had developed the ability to read men's souls through their eyes, their breathing patterns, their posture, even the way they held their cards. But more than that, he had learned how to project false signals that would mislead his opponents while appearing completely natural and unconscious. A typical poker game with Fitzpatrick was like watching a masterclass in human psychology. He would spend the first hour of any game carefully observing each player, learning their tells, their emotional patterns, their decision-making processes. Then he would begin a subtle campaign of psychological manipulation that was so skillful his opponents often didn't realize what was happening until they had lost everything they owned. But Fitzpatrick's poker wasn't about taking advantage of people. It was about creating the most sophisticated form of mental entertainment possible in the wilderness. His games became legendary because they pushed the boundaries of what was possible in terms of strategy, psychology, and pure intellectual competition. And then there were the buffalo hunts, which had evolved into something that resembled Roman gladiatorial games more than simple hunting expeditions. By the 1830s, these hunts had become elaborate spectacles that could involve hundreds of riders and last for days. The scale of these hunts is almost impossible to imagine today. Herds of buffalo would stretch across the plains for miles, creating a moving carpet of brown fur that darkened the landscape from horizon to horizon. And riding alongside these herds, mountain men would compete in contests that tested every skill they had, developed during their years in the wilderness. There were contests for who could bring down the largest bull with a single shot from horseback, contests for who could ride closest to the herd without being trampled, contests for who could make the most difficult shot while galloping at full speed. But the most spectacular contest was called buffalo jousting, where riders would attempt to leap from their horses onto the backs of running buffalo and ride them like wild broncos. I know that sounds absolutely insane, and it was. But remember, these were men who had spent years developing an almost supernatural level of horsemanship and an intimate understanding of animal behavior. They weren't just showing off. They were pushing the boundaries of what was humanly possible. Old Bill Williams took wilderness entertainment in a completely different direction by becoming the first mountain man to create sophisticated indoor games designed specifically for the long winter months when outdoor activities were impossible. Williams would spend his summers collecting materials, elk antler, buffalo bone, special stones, and rare woods that he would use during the winter to carve elaborate game sets. His chess sets were works of art, with pieces that represented different aspects of mountain life. The pawns were trappers, the rooks were trading posts, the bishops were medicine men, and the king and queen were the legendary figures of mountain man culture. But Williams didn't just carve beautiful game pieces. He invented entirely new games that reflected the realities of wilderness life. He created a strategy game called Territory, where players had to navigate their pieces through hostile terrain while avoiding natural disasters, competing trappers, and limited resources. The game could take weeks to complete, and required the kind of long-term strategic thinking that made the difference between life and death in the real wilderness. Williams also invented elaborate card games with evolving rules that changed based on the player's performance. As players got better at the game, new challenges and complications would be introduced, keeping the entertainment fresh and challenging even during months of isolation. Jim Baker took the physical competition aspect of mountain man entertainment to new heights by creating wrestling styles that incorporated techniques learned from different Native American tribes. Baker had spent years living with various tribes, learning their fighting techniques, their training methods, and their philosophies about physical competition. Baker's wrestling matches became legendary because they weren't just tests of strength, they were cultural exchanges that brought together different traditions of physical entertainment. He would demonstrate Shoshone grappling techniques, crow throwing methods, and Ute ground fighting skills, creating a uniquely American form of martial arts that was both practical, self-defense, and spectacular entertainment. These wrestling matches could last for hours, with each contestant trying to prove not just their physical superiority, but their knowledge of different fighting traditions. The audiences for these matches included both mountain men and Native American observers, creating a kind of international competition that helped build understanding and respect between different cultures. But perhaps the most elaborate form of entertainment during this golden age was the practical joke campaigns that could take months to plan and execute. The mountain men had elevated pranking to the level of performance art, creating elaborate hoaxes that were simultaneously hilarious and educational. The most famous practical joke of this era was Hugh Glass's Wolverine domestication hoax, which we touched on yesterday. But that was just one example of a whole culture of elaborate pranks that served multiple purposes. These jokes weren't just about getting laughs, they were about testing newcomers, teaching wilderness skills, and creating shared experiences that bonded the mountain man community together. One of Jim Bridger's most elaborate hoaxes involved convincing a group of Eastern investors that he had discovered a valley where gravity worked backwards. He spent weeks setting up this joke, creating demonstrations that appeared to show water flowing uphill, rocks falling upward, and animals that could walk on the ceiling of caves. The hoax was so elaborate and so convincing that several investors actually traveled west to see this miraculous valley for themselves. And when they finally realized they had been fooled, they weren't angry. They were impressed by the creativity and showmanship that had gone into the deception. These practical jokes served an important educational function in mountain man culture. They taught newcomers to question everything, to think critically about what they were seeing, and to understand that the wilderness was a place where the impossible often turned out to be true, and the obviously true sometimes turned out to be impossible. The rendezvous gatherings of the 1830s had evolved into elaborate festivals that rivaled anything happening in the cities back east. These weren't just trading meetings anymore. They were cultural celebrations that brought together thousands of people from dozens of different backgrounds and traditions. A typical rendezvous would feature simultaneous competitions in shooting, wrestling, horse racing, storytelling, gambling, practical joking, and crafts. There would be markets selling everything from practical supplies to luxury items brought from as far away as China and Europe. There would be diplomatic meetings between different tribes and trading companies. And through it all, there would be constant entertainment designed to keep thousands of people engaged and happy for weeks at a time. The storytelling competitions had evolved into elaborate theatrical performances with multiple acts, recurring characters, and story arcs that continued from one rendezvous to the next. Some storytellers specialized in adventure tales, others in comedy, still others in historical epics that traced the development of mountain man culture from its earliest beginnings. The gambling had become so sophisticated that it included games of pure strategy, games of pure chance, and games that combined luck, skill, psychology, and showmanship in incredibly complex ways. Professional gamblers would travel from rendezvous to rendezvous, challenging local champions and creating a kind of informal professional circuit. But what really made this golden age special was the way all these different forms of entertainment reinforced and supported each other. A man who excelled at storytelling would use his narrative skills to enhance his poker playing. A champion wrestler would incorporate dramatic techniques learned from watching theatrical performances. A master practical joker would use psychological insights gained from gambling to create more sophisticated hoaxes. The result was a culture of entertainment that was incredibly rich, diverse, and sophisticated, far more complex than anything most people associate with primitive frontier life. These mountain men had created a form of civilization that was based entirely on creativity, competition, and the celebration of human potential. And they were proving something that would become central to American culture, Imeke, that entertainment isn't something you consume, it's something you create. It's not about having the latest technology or the fanciest venues. It's about having the imagination to turn any situation into an opportunity for wonder, competition, and shared joy. Tomorrow, we're going to see what happened when this incredible entertainment culture collided with the darker realities of frontier life. We're going to witness mountain man entertainment at its most dangerous and most desperate, when the line between sport and survival disappeared completely. But for now, think about what we've just discovered. These men had created a form of entertainment that was simultaneously deeply personal and profoundly communal. They had turned individual skills into shared celebrations, personal challenges into community events, and survival techniques into high art. They had proven that human creativity and the desire for entertainment are so powerful that they can flourish anywhere, under any conditions, no matter how challenging or isolated the circumstances might be. Welcome back. We've been following the incredible evolution of mountain man entertainment, and now we're reaching the late 1830s, a time when entertainment and survival became so intertwined that they were virtually impossible to separate. Today, we're going to witness mountain man entertainment at its most extreme, most dangerous, and most spectacular. Get ready for a chapter where the stakes couldn't be higher. By the late 1830s, something fundamental had changed in the world of mountain men. The easy beaver streams were getting trapped out, competition between different fur companies was becoming violent, and conflicts with Native American tribes were escalating. The wilderness was becoming more dangerous, and the mountain men's response to this increased danger was absolutely remarkable. They turned it into entertainment. This might sound crazy to us today, but think about it from their perspective. These men had spent years developing the philosophy that any challenge could be transformed into entertainment. They had proven this with blizzards, bear encounters, and months of isolation. So when external threats started mounting, their natural response was to find ways to turn those threats into the ultimate forms of competition and performance. Joe Walker became the undisputed champion of what might have been the most dangerous, the form of entertainment ever created: grizzly bear fighting contests. Now, I need you to understand that these weren't just random encounters with bears. These were carefully planned, elaborately staged events that tested human courage against nature's most powerful predator. Walker would spend weeks preparing for these contests. He would study bear behavior, practice with different weapons and techniques, and develop strategies that gave him the best possible chance of survival. But survival wasn't the only goal. Entertainment was equally important. These contests had to be spectacular enough to justify the enormous risks involved. The typical bear fighting contest took place in a natural amphitheater, i.s., usually a box canyon or a clearing surrounded by steep rocks where spectators could watch safely from above. The bear would be captured alive and brought to the arena in a specially built cage, and then, armed only with a knife and his wits, a mountain man would enter the arena for what was essentially a gladiatorial combat between human intelligence and animal power. But here's what made these contests more than just mindless violence. They were incredibly sophisticated demonstrations of wilderness skills. The successful bear fighters weren't just brave, they were master students of animal psychology, experts in reading body language and movement patterns, and tactical geniuses who could outthink a creature that was faster, stronger, and better armed than they were. Walker's most famous bear fighting victory involved a contest that lasted over an hour. The bear, a massive 800-pound male grizzly, had already killed 2 men who had challenged it in previous contests. But Walker had studied the recordings of those fights and identified patterns in the bear's attack strategies. Instead of trying to overpower the bear, Walker used a combination of psychology and endurance tactics. He moved constantly, never allowing the bear to corner him, and used a series of feints and distractions to tire the animal out. When the bear finally made its decisive charge, Walker was ready with a perfectly timed knife thrust that ended the contest instantly. But the real entertainment wasn't just in the fight itself. It was in Walker's ability to explain his strategy to the audience afterward. He would describe every decision, every movement, every moment of psychological insight that had led to his victory. These post-fight analyses became almost as popular as the fights themselves, because they revealed the incredible sophistication that lay behind what appeared to be simple physical courage. Meanwhile, the horse racing had evolved into something that resembled military campaigns more than simple competitions. These weren't races around a track. They were elaborate expeditions that crossed territories controlled by hostile tribes and tested every skill a mountain man possessed. The most famous of these racing circuits was called the Hostile Territory Challenge, which involved a course that started at the Green River Rendezvous, crossed through Blackfoot territory, navigated the treacherous passes of the Continental Divide, and finished at a trading post on the Columbia River. The total distance was over 800 miles, and the course passed through some of the most dangerous terrain in North America. But here's what made these races truly spectacular. They weren't just tests of speed and endurance. They were intelligence-gathering operations, diplomatic missions, and survival challenges all rolled into one incredible competition. Racers had to carry messages between distant trading posts, negotiate safe passage through tribal territories, and survive encounters with everything from grizzly bears to flash floods. The winner wasn't necessarily the first person to cross the finish line. It was the person who completed the course while accomplishing the most additional objectives and demonstrating the greatest skill in handling unexpected challenges. These races became so popular that Native American tribes started organizing their own versions, creating an informal network of competitions that spanned the entire western frontier. The races became a form of international diplomacy, with tribal champions competing against mountain man champions in contests that built respect and understanding between different cultures. The gambling marathons of Pierre's Hole reached legendary status during this period. These weren't casual card games. They were elaborate tournaments that could last for weeks and involved psychological warfare that pushed participants to their absolute limits. The most famous gambling marathon of this era lasted for 23 days and involved 47 players from 6 different cultural backgrounds. The stakes started high and kept escalating throughout the tournament, with players betting everything from their rifles and horses to their winter supplies and even their lives. But the real entertainment wasn't just in the gambling itself. It was in the incredible psychological drama that unfolded as players were gradually eliminated. Each elimination became a story worth telling, because the best players didn't just lose their money, they lost in spectacular fashion, with dramatic final hands that revealed everything about their character, their strategy, and their ability to handle pressure. The winner of that legendary 23-day tournament was a Crow warrior named Seize Far, who had never played poker before arriving at the rendezvous, but he had approached the game like a sacred ritual, studying each opponent with the same intensity that he studied animal tracks when hunting. His victory became the stuff of legend, not because of the money he won, but because of the incredible psychological insights he demonstrated throughout the tournament. Native American tribes were contributing their own forms of extreme entertainment during this period. The sacred ball game, which could determine tribal leadership and resolve disputes between different bands, became a regular feature at rendezvous gatherings. This wasn't just a sport. It was a combination of athletics, warfare, spirituality, and politics that could last for days and involve hundreds of participants. The ball game tested everything from physical endurance to strategic thinking to spiritual power, and the outcomes often had consequences that lasted for generations. Mountain men who were invited to participate in these sacred games were receiving an incredible honor, because they were being accepted as equals in competitions that went to the heart of Native American culture. And many mountain men proved themselves worthy of this honor, bringing the same creativity and competitive spirit to tribal games that they brought to their own entertainment traditions. The stick-counting games that required supernatural perception to master became another form of cross-cultural entertainment that pushed human abilities to their absolute limits. These games tested powers of observation, memory, and intuition that most people didn't even know they possessed. Players would observe elaborate sequences of stick movements, drum beats, and ritual gestures, then attempt to predict complex patterns that seemed impossible to calculate rationally. The best players developed what appeared to be psychic abilities, making predictions that were so accurate they seemed supernatural. But here's what's fascinating about these games. They weren't actually supernatural at all. They were incredibly sophisticated tests of human perception and pattern recognition that revealed capabilities that most people never learn to develop. Mountain men who mastered these games were developing skills that made them better trackers, better weather predictors, and better survivors in every aspect of wilderness life. Even warfare became a form of entertainment during this period, as competing fur companies staged elaborate raids and counter-raids that resembled medieval tournaments more than serious military conflicts. These weren't battles fought to the death. They were elaborate competitions designed to test courage, strategy, and skill while minimizing actual casualties. The rules of these fur company wars were incredibly complex and sophisticated. Captured opponents were often released after proving their courage and skill in formal combat. Territory was gained and lost based on the outcomes of single combat between champions, and the entire conflict was conducted with a level of honor and sportsmanship that turned deadly serious business competition into spectacular entertainment. These corporate warfare games created heroes and legends that were celebrated throughout the Mountain Man community. Men like Hugh Glass and Jim Bridger gained fame not just for their individual skills, but for their ability to lead teams in elaborate strategic competitions that combined elements of military tactics, athletic competition, and theatrical performance. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this period was how all these dangerous forms of entertainment served practical purposes in the Mountain Man community. The bear fighting contests weren't just thrilling spectacles, they were training exercises that prepared men for real bear encounters. The hostile territory horse races weren't just competitions, they were intelligence-gathering operations that provided valuable information about tribal movements and territorial conditions. The gambling marathons weren't just entertainment, passiation. They were sophisticated exercises in risk assessment and psychological analysis that prepared men for the life-or-death decisions they faced every day in the make of part wilderness. And the warfare games weren't just fun, they were military training exercises that built the tactical skills and unit cohesion that could mean the difference between success and failure in real conflicts. This integration of entertainment and practical training created a culture where men were constantly improving their survival skills while having the time of their lives. It was a form of education that was so engaging and so effective that participants often forgot they were learning anything at all. But this golden age of extreme mountain man entertainment was about to face its greatest challenge. Economic changes, territorial shifts, and cultural pressures were building that would test whether this incredible entertainment culture could survive the transition from the wild frontier to the settled West. Tomorrow, we're going to see what happened when the beaver trade collapsed and the California gold rush began pulling mountain men in completely new directions. We're going to witness how these master entertainers adapted their skills to survive in a rapidly changing world, and how their entertainment traditions evolved to meet new challenges. But Now, think about what we've just witnessed. These men had created forms of entertainment that were simultaneously more dangerous and more sophisticated than anything most of us can imagine. They had proven that the human desire for challenge, competition, and spectacle is so powerful that it can transform even the most life-threatening situations into opportunities for celebration and community building. They had shown that entertainment isn't just about escaping from reality. Sometimes it's about engaging with reality so completely and so creatively that survival itself becomes a form of art. Welcome back to our incredible journey through Mountain Man entertainment. We've witnessed the golden age of wilderness entertainment, where men turned survival into high art and danger into spectacle. But now we're entering the 1840s, and everything is about to change. Today, we're going to see how these master entertainers adapted when their world started crumbling around them. Picture this. It's the dawn of the 1840s, and if you're a mountain man waking up in your winter cabin, you're starting to realize that something fundamental has shifted in your world. The beaver streams that seemed endless just a few years ago are now trapped out. The easy money that funded those spectacular rendezvous gatherings is drying up. And from California comes news of something that seems too incredible to believe. Not gold. More gold than anyone has ever seen, just lying in the stream beds waiting to be picked up. The beaver trade collapse wasn't just an economic catastrophe for mountain men. It was an existential crisis that threatened to destroy the entire culture of wilderness entertainment they had spent decades building. These weren't just trappers losing their jobs. These were artists losing their canvas, performers losing their stage, competitors losing their arena. But here's what's absolutely remarkable about how mountain men responded to this crisis. They didn't abandon their entertainment traditions. Instead, they adapted them, evolved them, and found new ways to apply their skills in a rapidly changing world. The gambling culture that had reached such sophisticated heights during the Golden Age now took on desperate edges that made it more thrilling and more dangerous than ever before. Men who once gambled with beaver pelts, renewable resources that they could always trap more of, now found themselves wagering their last horses, their guns, even their winter supplies in games that could literally mean the difference between life and death. I want you to imagine the psychological intensity of a poker game where the stakes aren't just money, but survival itself. Picture a card game taking place in a remote cabin during a blizzard, where the winner gets the only horse, the only rifle, and the only chance of making it to safety before spring. The loser gets to spend the winter with nothing but his wits and whatever he can. Improvise from the materials around him. These weren't games anymore. They were trials by ordeal that tested everything a mountain man had learned about reading human nature, managing risk, and performing under ultimate pressure. And paradoxically, as the stakes got higher, the entertainment value increased dramatically. These desperate gambling sessions became legendary because they revealed human character in ways that nothing else could. But the most transformative event of this period was the California Gold Rush of 1849, which created the largest migration in American history, and fundamentally changed how mountain men thought about entertainment and opportunity. Thousands of mountain men joined the rush to California, but they weren't just going to pan for gold. They were going to apply everything they had learned about wilderness entertainment to this new situation. And what they discovered was that prospecting was just another form of gambling, a high stakes, the game where the payoff could be enormous, but the odds were stacked against almost everyone who played. Mountain men brought their entertainment traditions to the gold fields and transformed prospecting from tedious manual labor into elaborate competitions and celebrations. They organized prospecting contests where teams would compete to see who could find the most gold in a single day. They created storytelling sessions where successful miners would share techniques and unlucky miners would spin tales about the ones that got away. But the real genius of mountain men in the gold fields was how they recognized that entertaining the other miners could be more profitable than mining itself. Kit Carson figured this out early and started charging prospectors to hear his legendary three-night adventure stories. Jim Bridger established a trading post where he sold supplies and entertainment packages to miners who were starving for any form of recreation after months of back-breaking labor. The stories that came out of the gold fields became a new chapter in Mountain Man entertainment tradition. These weren't just tales about finding gold. They were elaborate adventures that combined all the traditional elements of Mountain Man storytelling with the unique challenges and opportunities of prospecting. There were stories about prospectors who discovered caves filled with gold but guarded by bears. Tales of miners who struck it rich, only to lose everything in elaborate confidence games. Adventures involving claim jumpers, territorial disputes, and mining techniques that bordered on the supernatural. And through it all, the traditional Mountain Man emphasis on turning every challenge into entertainment opportunity. Meanwhile, back in the traditional Mountain Man territories, those who hadn't joined the gold rush were developing new forms of entertainment adapted to their changed circumstances. Winter entertainment became more sophisticated than ever before, as isolated. Trappers had more time and greater need for elaborate indoor activities. This was when mountain men really perfected the art of creating entertainment from almost nothing. A typical winter cabin might contain one deck of cards, some carving materials, basic musical instruments fashioned from natural materials, and whatever books or papers had survived the journey west. But from these simple materials, a skilled mountain man could create months of sophisticated entertainment. The card games evolved to include dozens of variations, each with its own rules, strategies, and traditions. The carving projects became increasingly elaborate, with men creating entire miniature worlds populated by detailed figures representing different aspects of mountain life. The musical traditions expanded to include complex compositions that told stories, taught survival skills, and preserved cultural memories. But perhaps the most important development during this period was the beginning of written Mountain Man literature. For the first time, some mountain men started writing down their stories, creating a permanent record of their entertainment traditions and adventure experiences. These weren't formal books written for publication, TA. They were personal journals, informal memoirs, and collections of stories intended to preserve mountain man culture for future generations. But they represent the first time that this incredibly rich oral tradition was being captured in written form. Kit Carson's transition during this period is particularly fascinating. As the traditional mountain man lifestyle became less viable, Carson found new ways to apply his entertainment skills to different audiences. He became a guide for wagon trains traveling the Oregon Trail, and he discovered that entertaining families during the long journey west was both a valuable service and a natural extension of his storytelling abilities. But Carson had to completely adapt his material for these new audiences. The stories that had thrilled audiences of tough mountain men around rendezvous campfires were often too violent, too crude, or too unbelievable for families traveling with children. So Carson developed edited versions of his adventures, stories that maintained the excitement and adventure elements while removing the content that might be inappropriate for mixed audiences. This process of adaptation actually improved Carson's storytelling skills, because it forced him to focus on the essential dramatic elements that made his stories compelling. He learned to create suspense, develop character, and build emotional engagement using techniques that were more sophisticated than anything he had used during the rendezvous period. Jim Bridger took a different approach to adapting his entertainment skills for changing times. He established a trading post and way station on the Oregon Trail, where he offered travelers a complete entertainment experience. Visitors could hear his famous tall tales, participate in shooting contests, learn wilderness skills, and purchase souvenirs that represented the golden age of mountain man culture. Bridger's trading post became a kind of living museum, where travelers could experience authentic mountain man entertainment while learning about the history and traditions of the wilderness culture. And Bridger discovered that there was enormous demand for this kind of cultural tourism, as thousands of emigrants were fascinated by the mountain man lifestyle but had no other way to experience it firsthand. The practical joke traditions continued during this period, but they evolved to serve new purposes. Instead of elaborate hoaxes designed to test newcomers' wilderness skills, mountain men started creating pranks that helped relieve the psychological stress of economic uncertainty and cultural change. These later practical jokes were gentler, more therapeutic, and focused on building community solidarity rather than testing individual competence. They were designed to help mountain men maintain their sense of humor and their cultural identity during a period when everything familiar was changing rapidly. The musical traditions also evolved significantly during this period. Mountain men had always used music as a form of entertainment, but the 1840s saw the development of more complex musical compositions that served multiple purposes: entertainment, education, cultural preservation, and emotional support. Men would compose songs that taught survival skills, preserved historical memories, processed emotional experiences, and maintained connections to the community even during long periods of isolation. These songs became an incredibly important part of mountain man culture because they provided continuity and stability during a time of rapid change. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of this transitional period was how mountain men began to realize that they were living through the end of an era. The entertainment traditions that had developed during the peak years of the fur trade were becoming historical artifacts, even as they were still being practiced. This awareness led to a kind of conscious preservation effort, as older mountain men made deliberate attempts to teach their entertainment traditions to younger generations who might carry them forward into whatever came next. Storytelling sessions became cultural preservation workshops. Gambling games became lessons in risk assessment and psychological analysis. Physical competitions became training exercises for skills that might be needed in unknown future challenges. The mountain men of the 1840s were proving something remarkable about human adaptability and cultural resilience. They were showing that entertainment traditions strong enough to survive in the wilderness were also strong enough to survive cultural and economic transformation. They were demonstrating that the skills required to create entertainment from nothing, i.e., creativity, adaptability, psychological insight, and community building, were exactly the same skills needed to succeed in a rapidly changing world. Tomorrow, we're going to see the final chapter of the Mountain Man era, as the last generation of these incredible entertainers became bridges between the wild past and the settled future. We're going to witness how their entertainment traditions were preserved, transformed, and passed on to influence American culture for generations to come. But for now, think about what we've discovered in this chapter. These men faced the collapse of their entire way of life, but instead of giving up, they found new ways to apply their entertainment traditions to completely different circumstances. They proved that true entertainment skills aren't dependent on specific conditions or resources. They're portable abilities that can create value and meaning in any situation. They showed us that entertainment isn't just about having fun. It's about maintaining hope, building community, and preserving what's most valuable in human culture, even when everything else is changing around you. Welcome back. We've journeyed through the rise and transformation of mountain man entertainment, and now we're approaching the end of an era. Today, we're going to witness how the final generation of true mountain men became living bridges between the wild past and the settled future, and how their incredible entertainment traditions found new purposes in a rapidly modernizing America. The final generation of mountain men faced a unique challenge. They were simultaneously the last practitioners of an ancient wilderness culture and the first ambassadors of that culture to the modern world. These weren't just entertainers anymore. They were cultural translators, responsible for preserving and transmitting traditions that might otherwise be lost forever. Kit Carson's transformation during the Mexican-American War. one of 1846 to 1848, perfectly illustrates how Mountain Man entertainment skills proved invaluable in completely unexpected contexts. Carson's legendary storytelling abilities, which had entertained thousands around rendezvous campfires, suddenly became crucial military intelligence tools. Picture this scene. Carson is interrogating captured Mexican soldiers, trying to extract information about troop movements and strategic plans. But instead of using traditional interrogation techniques, he's using his storytelling skills to create rapport, build trust, and encourage his subjects to share information voluntarily. Carson would begin by telling carefully chosen stories about his own adventures, creating an atmosphere of mutual respect and shared experience. Then he would gradually shift the conversation toward topics that revealed the information he needed, all while maintaining the entertaining, non-threatening tone that had made him famous as a performer. His gambling expertise proved equally valuable in reading enemy intentions and predicting strategic decisions. Carson could analyze the behavior patterns of opposing commanders with the same psychological insight he had used to dominate poker games, giving American forces significant advantages in planning and positioning. But Carson's most remarkable contribution during this period was his ability to maintain morale among American troops through entertainment. Long military campaigns in hostile territory created psychological challenges that were remarkably similar to the isolation and stress that mountain men had learned to handle through entertainment. Carson organized storytelling sessions that kept soldiers engaged and optimistic during difficult campaigns. He taught card games that provided entertainment while developing the kind of risk assessment skills that could be valuable in combat situations. And he created competitions that maintained physical fitness while building unit cohesion and competitive spirit. Meanwhile, Joe Meek was making an even more dramatic transition from wilderness entertainer to political representative. When Oregon Territory needed someone to travel to Washington, D.C., to lobby for territorial status, they chose Meek, not because of his political experience, but because of his incredible ability to entertain and persuade audiences. Meek's journey to Washington became one of the most remarkable cultural exchanges in American history. Here was a man who had spent decades perfecting entertainment techniques designed for audiences of tough mountain men, suddenly finding himself in the elegant drawing rooms and formal halls of the nation's capital. But instead of being intimidated by this completely different environment, Meek recognized it as just another audience that needed to be entertained and persuaded. He adapted his mountain man storytelling techniques for political purposes, using adventure narratives to illustrate points about territorial governance and economic development. Meek's demonstrations of mountain man entertainment techniques amazed Washington politicians who had never seen anything like frontier skill competitions. He would demonstrate shooting techniques that seemed impossible to Eastern audiences, perform feats of horsemanship that left spectators speechless, and tell stories that made the Western Territories sound like the most exciting place on earth. But the real genius of Meek's political entertainment was how he used humor and adventure stories to make complex policy arguments. Instead of boring his audiences with statistics and legal arguments, he would tell entertaining stories that illustrated why Oregon Territory deserved statehood and federal support. His success in Washington proved that mountain man entertainment skills were far more transferable than anyone had realized. The same abilities that had built community around wilderness campfires could also build political coalitions in the halls of power. The last great rendezvous gatherings of the 1840s took on a nostalgic quality that was both celebratory and melancholy. These weren't just entertainment festivals anymore, they were cultural preservation events, where aging mountain men consciously taught their traditions to a new generation of guides, soldiers, and settlers. These final rendezvous had a different energy than the wild celebrations of the Golden Age. There was more ceremony, more formal instruction, and more emphasis on preserving specific techniques and traditions that might otherwise be lost. Older mountain men would spend hours teaching younger participants the fine points of storytelling, the psychology of gambling, the ethics of practical joking, and the spiritual aspects of wilderness competition. But these weren't just nostalgic, backward-looking events. They were also laboratories where mountain men experimented with adapting their entertainment, traditions for new audiences and new purposes. They were figuring out which aspects of their culture could be preserved intact and which needed to be modified for changing circumstances. The stories told at these final rendezvous became more sophisticated and more historically conscious than the adventure tales of earlier years. Mountain men were beginning to understand that they were living through a historical transition, and they wanted to make sure their experiences were preserved accurately for future generations. Some mountain men, like Jim Baker, lived long enough to see their entertainment methods adapted for commercial purposes in dude ranches and Wild West shows. This transition from authentic cultural practice to commercial entertainment created complex feelings among the original practitioners. On one hand, they were proud to see their traditions gaining wider recognition and appreciation. The skills they had developed in obscurity were finally being acknowledged as valuable and entertaining by broader audiences. Their stories, competitions, and demonstrations were drawing crowds and generating income for performers who understood and respected the original traditions. But there was also sadness in watching their private wilderness festivals transform into public spectacles. The intimate community-building aspects of mountain man entertainment were difficult to preserve when the audience consisted of paying customers rather than fellow practitioners. Baker and others who made this transition had to learn new skills: how to perform for audiences who had no wilderness experience, how to explain cultural contexts that had been taken for granted in the original community, and how to maintain the authentic spirit of mountain man entertainment while adapting it for commercial purposes. The influence of mountain man entertainment on the developing American military was profound and lasting. The psychological techniques that mountain men had, developed for maintaining morale during long periods of isolation and stress, proved incredibly valuable for military units operating in frontier conditions. The competitive traditions that had built community and maintained physical fitness during rendezvous gatherings were adapted to create military training exercises that were both effective and entertaining. The storytelling techniques that had preserved cultural memory and built group identity were used to maintain unit cohesion and transmit tactical knowledge. Even the practical joke traditions found new purposes in military culture, as officers discovered that the same techniques mountain men had used to test newcomers and build community bonds could be adapted to build trust and loyalty among soldiers from diverse backgrounds. The gambling skills that had reached such sophisticated levels in mountain man culture proved valuable in military intelligence and strategic planning. Officers who understood the psychological principles behind wilderness gambling were better able to assess risks, read opponents, and make decisions under pressure. During this transitional period, mountain men also began to influence the development of American outdoor recreation culture. Eastern Americans who had heard stories about mountain man entertainment started organizing their own camping trips, hunting expeditions, and outdoor competitions based on wilderness traditions. The fishing and hunting clubs that became popular in eastern cities during the 1850s and 1860s were directly influenced by mountain man entertainment traditions. These clubs adopted the storytelling customs, competitive formats, and community-building practices that had been perfected around rendezvous campfires. Even the emerging tradition of summer camping, which would eventually become a central part of American family culture, borrowed heavily from mountain man entertainment techniques. The emphasis on campfire, storytelling, outdoor competitions, and creating community in natural settings all traced directly back to wilderness entertainment traditions. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of this final generation of mountain men was their influence on American business culture. The entrepreneurial skills that had enabled them to create entertainment from nothing proved remarkably valuable in the rapidly expanding American economy. Former mountain men became successful in industries ranging from transportation to entertainment to retail, bringing with them a set of skills that included adaptability, risk assessment, customer relations, and the ability to create value from minimal resources. The psychological insights they had developed through years of reading human nature in high-stakes gambling situations made them natural salesmen and negotiators. The showmanship skills they had perfected in wilderness competitions made them effective promoters and marketers, and the community-building abilities they had developed through entertainment traditions made them natural leaders and organizers. But perhaps most importantly, these final mountain men proved that cultural traditions could survive and adapt to changing circumstances if they were based on fundamental human needs and capabilities. Mountain Man Entertainment had survived because it addressed basic human requirements for challenge, community, meaning, and celebration. The specific forms might change. Storytelling might move from campfires to books to radio to television. Competitions might move from wilderness to organized sports to video games. Community building might use different technologies and venues, but the underlying principles remained constant and valuable. Tomorrow, we're going to see how Mountain Man entertainment traditions blazed through American popular culture and influenced everything from literature to movies to modern outdoor recreation. We're going to discover that the legacy of these wilderness entertainers is still shaping how Americans think about adventure, competition, and community building. But for now, think about what we've witnessed in this chapter. The final generation of mountain men didn't just preserve their traditions, they translated them, adapted them, and found new ways to apply them in a modern context. They proved that valuable cultural practices don't disappear when circumstances change. They evolve and find new forms of expression. They showed us that entertainment traditions strong enough to survive in the wilderness are also strong enough to enrich civilization. And they demonstrated that the skills required to create meaning and community in the most challenging circumstances are exactly the skills needed to build a better society for everyone. Welcome to our final chapter together. We followed the incredible journey of Mountain Man Entertainment, from its humble beginnings around lonely campfires to its NOS transformation into a cultural force that would influence American society for generations. Today, we're going to discover how these wilderness entertainment traditions blaze through popular culture and continue to shape how we think about adventure, community, and the human spirit. Though the last mountain man died before 1900, their entertainment traditions didn't disappear. They exploded into American popular culture like sparks from a campfire, igniting imaginations and inspiring new forms of entertainment that millions of people still enjoy today. The transformation began with Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows, which brought Mountain Man entertainment traditions to audiences in New York, London, Paris, and cities around the world. But Cody wasn't just putting on a show, he was translating authentic wilderness entertainment for mass audiences, preserving the essential spirit while adapting the format for people who had never experienced frontier life. Picture this incredible scene. Madison Square Garden, 1885. Thousands of people who have never been west of the Hudson River are watching authentic mountain man competitions performed by men who actually lived that life. There's Kit Carson's nephew demonstrating the shooting techniques that had amazed rendezvous audiences decades earlier. Former mountain men are telling stories that had been perfected around wilderness campfires to audiences wearing evening dress and opera gloves. But here's what made Buffalo Bill's shows more than just nostalgic entertainment. They were preserving and transmitting cultural values that were essential to American identity. The emphasis on individual skill, the celebration of courage under pressure, the combination of competition and community building, the transformation of survival challenges into entertainment opportunities, all of these mountain man traditions were being passed on to new generations in new forms. The influence on American literature was immediate and profound. Dime novelists discovered that mountain man entertainment traditions provided perfect templates for popular fiction. The tall tale tradition that Jim Bridger had perfected became the foundation for countless Western novels. The adventure story structures that Kit Carson had developed were adapted for serialized fiction that entertained millions of readers. Authors like Bret Harte and Mark Twain drew heavily on Mountain Man storytelling techniques, particularly the use of humor, exaggeration, and regional dialect to create distinctly American forms of literature. The tall tale tradition evolved into a uniquely American literary genre that influenced writers from Washington Irving to tall tale collections that are still popular today. But the literary influence went deeper than just story structure and style. Mountain Man Entertainment had always emphasized the importance of turning personal experience into shared narrative, and this became a central theme in American literature. The idea that individual adventure could become community entertainment, that personal challenges could be transformed into universal stories, became fundamental to how American writers approached their craft. The gambling traditions that had reached such sophisticated levels in Mountain Man culture influenced the development of American gaming and sports culture. The psychological principles that mountain men had discovered through wilderness poker were applied to everything from horse racing to stock market speculation to professional sports. The emphasis on reading human nature, managing risk, and performing under pressure became central to American competitive culture. Modern poker tournaments, with their combination of skill, psychology, and showmanship, are direct descendants of the gambling marathons that took place at Pierre's Hole and other rendezvous sites. But even more importantly, the Mountain Man approach to gambling, IMPs, treating it as entertainment, education, and community building rather than just money-making, influenced how Americans thought about competition in general. The idea that contests should be fun, fair, and socially valuable became embedded in American sports culture. The practical joke traditions of mountain men evolved into distinctly American forms of humor that influenced everything from vaudeville to television comedy. The elaborate hoaxes that had served educational and community-building functions in wilderness culture were adapted for entertainment purposes that reached mass audiences. The psychological sophistication that mountain men had developed in their practical joke campaigns influenced American advertising, marketing, and entertainment industries. The understanding of how to create suspense, build anticipation, and deliver surprising revelations became fundamental to American popular entertainment. But perhaps the most significant influence was on the development of modern outdoor recreation culture. The mountain man philosophy that wilderness challenges could be transformed into entertainment opportunities became the foundation for an entire industry that now serves millions of Americans. Modern camping culture adopted mountain man methods of creating community around fires in natural settings. The storytelling traditions, the emphasis on skills competition, the combination of individual challenge and group support, all of these elements trace directly back to wilderness entertainment traditions. The development of organized outdoor activities like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts was heavily influenced by mountain man entertainment principles. The focus on skill development through fun activities, the use of advancement systems based on demonstrated competence, the emphasis on character building through outdoor challenges, these were all adaptations of mountain man cultural practices. Even extreme sports and adventure tourism are modern expressions of the mountain man philosophy that entertainment value increases with challenge level. Rock climbing, whitewater rafting, backcountry skiing, and wilderness survival experiences all follow patterns established by men who turned survival into sport 2 centuries ago. The influence on Hollywood and American film culture was immediate and lasting. Western movies drew heavily on mountain man entertainment traditions, but the influence went far beyond just the Western genre. The emphasis on individual heroism, the celebration of skill under pressure, the transformation of challenges into entertainment, these became fundamental elements of American cinema. Actors like John Wayne portrayed characters who gambled, fought, and told stories exactly like Bridger and Carson had done a century earlier. But the Mountain Man influence also shaped how Hollywood approached action sequences, character development, and the relationship between individual achievement and community values. The storytelling techniques that Mountain Men had developed for live audiences around campfires were adapted for film audiences around the world. The emphasis on building suspense through detail, the use of humor to relieve tension, the celebration of human resourcefulness in challenging circumstances, these became standard elements of American filmmaking. Modern television shows about survival, outdoor adventure, and competition programming are direct descendants of Mountain Man entertainment traditions. Reality shows that place contestants in challenging environments and test their ability to entertain each other follow exactly the same patterns that Mountain Men developed during their wilderness gatherings. But the influence extends beyond just entertainment media. Mountain Man traditions shaped American business culture in ways that are still visible today. The entrepreneurial philosophy that entertainment and value could be created from minimal resources became fundamental to American business thinking. The sales and marketing techniques that former Mountain Men developed when transitioning to civilian occupations influenced the development of American advertising and customer relations. The emphasis on building relationships through entertainment, the use of storytelling to convey complex information, the focus on creating memorable experiences rather than just delivering products. These all trace back to wilderness entertainment traditions. The team building and leadership development approaches used by modern American corporations often borrow directly from Mountain Man community building techniques. Corporate retreat programs that use outdoor challenges to build cooperation and trust are applying principles that were perfected around rendezvous campfires. Even modern American political culture shows the influence of Mountain Man entertainment traditions. The use of storytelling to convey policy positions, the emphasis on individual character, personal experience, the celebration of frontier values and pioneer spirit. These all reflect the cultural influence of wilderness entertainment traditions. Political candidates who emphasize their outdoor experience, their connection to traditional American values, and their ability to handle challenges are appealing to cultural patterns that were established by Mountain Man entertainers. The political effectiveness of these appeals demonstrates how deeply Mountain Man values are embedded in American cultural consciousness. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Mountain Man entertainment is the demonstration that human creativity and the desire for community can flourish under any circumstances. These men proved that entertainment isn't dependent on technology, wealth, or institutional support, SA. It's dependent on imagination, skill, and the willingness to transform challenges into opportunities for celebration. In our modern world, where we often feel overwhelmed by the resile, the complexity of technology and the pace of change, the Mountain Man example reminds us that the most valuable forms of entertainment are often the simplest. The ability to tell a compelling story, to create fair and engaging competitions, to build community through shared experiences, to find humor in difficult circumstances, these skills are as valuable today as they were 2 centuries ago. The Mountain Men also demonstrated that the best entertainment serves multiple purposes simultaneously. Their activities weren't just fun, they were also educational, therapeutic, community building, and character developing. They proved that entertainment could be meaningful without being pretentious, challenging without being destructive, and individual without being selfish. Today's outdoor recreation industry, with its emphasis on adventure tourism, extreme sports, and wilderness experiences, follows patterns established by men who proved that the human spirit doesn't just survive in challenging environments, it celebrates. Every time someone goes camping and tells stories around a fire, participates in outdoor competitions, or seeks adventure in natural settings, they're participating in traditions that began with lonely mountain men who refused to let isolation defeat their need for entertainment and community. The legacy lives on in every rodeo that celebrates the skills and values of frontier culture. It continues in every hunting and fishing story that transforms personal experience into shared entertainment. It persists in every outdoor education program that teaches young people to find adventure and meaning in natural settings. And perhaps most importantly, it endures in the distinctly American belief that individual freedom and community responsibility can be balanced, that challenges can be transformed into opportunities, and that entertainment is not a luxury but a necessity for human flourishing. The mountain men taught us that in the depths of nowhere, with nothing but creativity and courage, human beings can create something beautiful, meaningful, and lasting. They proved that entertainment isn't about having more things, it's about having more life, more adventure, more stories worth sharing. Their campfires may have burned out long ago, but the light they created still guides us. Every time we gather with friends to share stories, compete in friendly contests, or seek adventure in the natural world, we're keeping alive traditions that began with men who looked at an empty wilderness and saw infinite possibilities for wonder, challenge, and celebration. The eternal campfire of mountain man entertainment continues to burn in the American spirit, reminding us that no matter how far we travel from the frontier, we carry within us the capacity to create meaning, community, and joy from the simplest materials: courage, imagination, and the endless human need to turn survival into art. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the world of mountain man entertainment. I hope their story has inspired you to look for adventure in your own life, to find community in unexpected places, and to remember that the best entertainment often comes not from what we consume, but from what we create together.